Welcome to another study in the Gospel of Mark. We're going to explore the theme in this final video of how Mark reveals to us the story of
Tell me the story of Jesus. Write on my heart every word. Tell me the story most precious, sweetest that ever was heard.
Well, it's a joy to be with you again as we come to the last video in this series. It is a summary video. We are thinking about how the Gospel of Mark can be summarized, how the Gospel of Mark perhaps could be preached. I've previously asked about the primary theme, the primary story that we should be grasping. In the Gospel of Mark, we've attempted to explore the theme of discipleship, thinking about what it means to walk in the way of a disciple. And today, in this final video, as we think about exploring the entirety of the Gospel of Mark, I want to think with you about the story of Jesus, and I'd like to present with you, review with you, the story of Jesus in 5 acts. That might be a little too long for the typical play, but here's the story of Jesus as Mark tells it to us in 5 acts. So we come to an understanding of the wonderful content of the book that we share together. Act 1, chapters 1 through 4. After an introductory declaration of who Jesus is, Mark chapter 1, verse 1, we come to the first 4 chapters. These become an act in and of themselves because everything that Jesus does in these first 4 chapters is in the central area of what we know today as Israel, of Palestine in that time, around the Sea of Galilee, Capernaum on the north, Galilee, where the city of Nazareth, where Jesus grew up, would have been, and eventually in more rural areas because of the popularity that he experienced and unable to enter the cities. But the work, even though there may have been Gentiles present according to some of the notes in the text, this is a work that Jesus does, coming to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. This is a work that Jesus does among the Jews. This is Act 1. The purpose of our study in this last video is not to review all of the details of what Jesus did, the wonderful words, the amazing actions, the things that he did that continually caused astonishment and admiration, the encounters with the Jewish leaders. All of those are a part of the story, and it's interesting to see themes introduced, themes such as fear and faith, Jesus' desire to touch the lives of people, the fact that Jewish leaders, especially bringing together parties that normally would be at odds one with another, the Pharisees and the Herodians, the ability to bring them together because of their concern for one who comes declaring the kingdom, bringing the kingdom, saying the time for the kingdom is right. This is the opportune time. The good news has come, the good news of the kingdom, the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, the good news of God himself. And yet, in contrast to chapter 1 and verse 1, we have the last verse of chapter 4, when after we finish Act 1, or as we finish Act 1, and we prepare to cross the sea to go for Act 2, it's kind of a climactic ending to the first act. As we cross the sea, Jesus calms the storm, the winds and the waves obey his will, and he says to his disciples in their fearfulness, "Why are you so afraid? Do you not yet have any faith?" So Act 1 closes as we think about the theme of discipleship. Jesus has now called 12 disciples. We have specific information about the calling of 4 of those as we begin his ministry. Then we have also the calling of Matthew, Levi, but disciples, fearful, and faithless. So we come to the second act, chapter 5, verse 1 through chapter 8, verse 21. Now, if we saw in 1:1 and 4:41 that there are 2 parallel ideas that frame Act 1, the use that Mark makes of framing stories, we see the same thing as we come to Act 2. They go across the lake to the region of the Gerasenes. They go into Gentile territory. They don't stay there long, but they go into Gentile territory. And as we come to the last part of this second act of Jesus' life, tell me the story of Jesus, the feeding of the 4,000 in Jewish territory before they cross back over in Gentile territory, before they cross back over into Jewish territory. Jesus warning the disciples about the yeast of the Pharisees and of Herod. And the last verse of this act, 8:21, he says to them, do you still not understand? So we have the disciples walking with Jesus. It's not only a work that's done among the Gentiles in Act 2, but the focus, it seems to me, with the framing stories of 5:1 following with the demon-possessed man, and then with the feeding of the 4,000 when 7 baskets are taken up, and the yeast of the Pharisees and Herod, that's the last warning of Jesus in this section, specifically directed to his disciples, and the question, do you still not understand? Now, of course, in the second act, Jesus has spent time not only among the Gentiles, but also among the Jews. He's been rejected by his own people. The disciples have been sent forth and have had great success. We have the feeding of the 5,000. We have the continuation of identity stories. But above all, it seems to me that with the healing of the demon-possessed man, with the healing of the daughter of the Syrophoenician woman, with the healing of the deaf and mute man at the end of chapter 7, a man who clearly is in the region of the Decapolis, the 10 cities, largely a Gentile region, and with the feeding of the 4,000, the difference between Act 1 and Act 2 is that we have purposefully moved so that Jesus' ministry is encompassing more and more the Gentiles. So we begin in Act 1, chapters 1 through 4, and now we've moved through Act 2. Disciples, I tried to figure out what word would describe the disciples at the end of Act 2, and while it's not a word that appears in the text, the word that I came up with was the word clueless. Disciples who are clueless. So we come to the third act, chapter 8, verse 22, through the end of chapter 10. This particular act, again, is framed by 2 parallel stories. This is the third time we've seen this happen in the book of Mark. So we have the healing of a blind man, a man who at first can see, but he does not see clearly. He sees people that look like trees walking around. So Jesus restores his sight and he sees everything clearly. Seems to be a theme that's going to be developed in the third act. And the last part of this third act will bring us to Jerusalem, to the healing of the blind man Bartimaeus. Now, to give more context for the story of Jesus, as we look at Act 3, we begin having crossed the sea, coming back into Jewish territory. But as we look at the 3 announcements of Jesus' death, as we think of the 3, sometimes they're called passion predictions, we see Jesus going to the north, to Caesarea Philippi for the first announcement, coming back to Capernaum in chapter 9, beginning in verse 30, for the second announcement. And having crossed into Judea, having crossed into the area around Jerusalem, we note that at the beginning of chapter 10, we come to the last of the Passion predictions, the last of the announcements, as we come to 10:32, and Jesus is on his way up to Jerusalem. And that same text says that the disciples were amazed. So little by little, perhaps we can conclude that as they see the story of Jesus, they are learning. They're disciples. That's what the word disciple means, a learner. And so the disciples are moving from being fearful and faithless to still not understanding. And now the text says that despite their failure to understand, they're amazed. Despite the fact that there are still big holes in their understanding, and they're afraid to ask, they continue to follow. They're walking with him on the way to Jerusalem, and they're amazed. We come to chapter 11, and we enter the fourth act of Jesus' life. And again, we have a framing story. We have the framing story of the triumphal entry, as it is normally called, chapter 11 and verse 1. But the Jews who are admiring him, the Jews who are the people who are spreading their cloaks on the road, we see that they are Jewish in background because of what they're saying. Hosanna, blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the coming kingdom of our father David. They're thinking about the restoration of the Davidic kingdom. And so as Jesus enters Jerusalem, the first story that we encounter in Acts chapter 4 is a story of Jews who are expressing admiration and are anticipating the coming of the kingdom, really not understanding yet exactly why Jesus has come and what his mission will be. But as we come to the end of the fourth act, we come to chapter 15, verse 47 is the end of the chapter. But I'm going to call our attention as we come back to verse 39, in 15:39, with the centurion who was standing there in front of Jesus. When the centurion heard his cry and saw how he had died, he said, "Surely this man was the Son of God." So this fourth act begins with a declaration on the part of Jewish followers with a misunderstanding, and concludes with the declaration of a Gentile centurion, "Surely this was the Son of God." Well, what will happen in the meantime, in the fourth act, is that while the disciples will accompany Jesus, and they will listen to his teachings, and they'll accompany him to the temple, and they'll see his encounter with the Jewish leaders that we read about in chapter 11 and chapter 12. And they will ask him concerning his statement that the temple will be destroyed in Mark chapter 13. He will take them under his wing, we might say, and he will eat with them the supper, the Passover meal, what we call the Last Supper. But when all of that has occurred and Gethsemane comes, the disciples will be scattered. They will no longer follow. It will remain to Joseph of Arimathea, who was a secret disciple, a prominent council member, but he was waiting for the kingdom. He was anticipating the coming of the kingdom, and he is the one who will bury the body of Jesus. Tell me the story of Jesus. 4 acts. Disciples fearful and faithless, disciples clueless, disciples amazed, disciples scattered. And we come to the last act, chapter 16, the 5th act. You and I already know the story. It's a story of resurrection. It's the story of Jesus appearing, first to Mary Magdalene, who goes and announces to the rest, but they do not believe. Later, Jesus appears to 2 who are walking in the country. They report it to the rest, and they do not believe them either. And Jesus himself appears in the midst of scattered disciples who yet are fearful, who are yet unbelieving, who yet have only a little faith at best. He rebukes them for their lack of faith and their stubbornness and their refusal to believe. But the story ends with disciples commissioned. Go into all the world and preach the good news to all creation. Whoever believes and is baptized will be saved, and whoever does not believe will be condemned. And I find hope in this telling of the story of Jesus. I find hope for us, even as we seek to learn the way of discipleship, as we seek to walk in the way of a disciple, that we ourselves, as we experience difficulties with faith, as we ourselves are fearful, as we fail to understand, and yet with amazement read again and again the story of the one who is our teacher, the one who is, may we say, our rabbi, but above all, the one who is for us, Son of God, Savior of the world, the bringer of good news, kingdom good news, the one who comes that we might be saved, the one who comes not only to save us as we are scattered and as we run here and there, but the one who commissions us that we might go forth as witnesses, bearing testimony to the impact of Jesus Christ in our life, bearing the good news of the kingdom, going into all the world and preaching the gospel, urging those who hear the good news to respond with belief and with baptism, that they too might be saved. Because the one who fails to obey, who fails to believe, and who fails to obey is the one who will be condemned. The story of Jesus, the story of disciples who followed Jesus, a story that is duplicated today in our lives. And as we walk the way of discipleship, and as we see the challenges that were a part of discipleship in the first century, and as we think about how those same challenges come to us today, I pray that you might find strength for the journey and help for your life as you seek to learn the way of a disciple and to walk in the way of a disciple. May God bless us. May God bless you in your study of the Gospel of Mark, that you might, as you hear the story of Jesus and as you respond to the story of Jesus, that you too might go forth and tell the good news, the story of Jesus. Thank you for sharing with us this study of the Gospel of Mark. If I can help you as you would seek to respond to the gospel of Jesus Christ, I stand ready to do that and would love to hear from you, that we might study together or that we might assist one another in becoming obedient followers of Jesus Christ. God bless.